The most prominent threats facing California right now are wildfires and the resulting smoke, as well as sea level rise. And it's a direct result of climate change. The negative impact of these environmental hazards is felt disproportionately in the Bay Area, depending on geography, but also because of environmental injustice.
Established in 1961 by three Bay Area residents, Sylvia McLaughlin, Kay Kerr, and Esther Golick, Save the Bay is the oldest and largest organization working exclusively to restore San Francisco Bay. Since the gold rush, the Bay has shrunk drastically due to mass urbanization. Wetlands were destroyed and diked to create farms and salt ponds. Today, only 5% of the Bay's original wetlands remain.
Our goal comes from a report that San Francisco Estuary Institute put out a couple of years ago, I think in the 90s actually. And that goal is to reach 100,000 restored acres of tidal marsh. So we are one organization that's doing restoration work to help reach that goal.
Save the Bay focuses its restoration on the transition zone, which is an ecotown between tidal marsh and upland. The transition zone offers a refuge for wildlife when the tides rises, so they can be protected from the water and continue looking for food.
Some of the biggest challenges that we have encountered in our restoration work are getting landowners to donate or sell their land for restoration projects. We see this playing out in Redwood City in the South Bay with the salt ponds owned by Cargill there. They would rather sell their land to developers to build apartments, businesses, because they'll make more money. But we know that these areas are going to be impacted by sea level rise, so it's not a good idea to build homes and businesses where we know flooding events will happen and cause damage.
Yes, so the entirety of the salt pond networks in the South Bay were at one point owned by private companies. Now, almost all of them are turned back into public land. Most of the salt pond areas that we see if you were to fly into one of the airports that ring the Bay, most of them are not in production right now. A lot of the land that's developed that would have historically been tidal marsh is now very diverse infrastructure. So obviously, we can't take the Oakland airport and turn that back into a tidal marsh as it historically once was. But the areas that are easy to restore and don't have infrastructure that would be destroyed are often those salt ponds in the South Bay. So those are large acreage areas of land that hadn't been developed that have the potential to get turned back into tidal marsh.
So today we are on the east side of Bedwell Bayfront Park. What we've been doing over the last couple of weeks is cutting out sod pieces of those native plants, and you can see some of them here. They're 6 inches by 18 inches by about 4 inches tall. We have the alkali heath and the saltgrass in the low part of the transition zone, and we have the ragweed and the creeping wild rye in the high part of the transition zone. And we've spread out these sod pieces more or less 5 to 3 meters apart, so that when the disking machine comes through, they'll be spread evenly throughout the entire site. So the salt ponds, including where we're standing right now, would have been tidal marsh. Long ago, they built a levee and diked this space off from the flow of the tides. They let the water dry up so that they could create salt to sell commercially and use for salt products. Now they're going to breach the levee out towards the bay. That water is going to be allowed to flow back in, and all of these plants will be here ready to take advantage of that water when it gets here.
By repeating this process, the dry-up salt ponds will once again return to lush wetlands covered with native plants. Tidal marsh not only provides habitats, it's a critical buffer between the rising sea levels and the shoreline communities. Research made by California Ocean Protection Council estimated the bay water could rise by up to 1.9 feet by 2050. And 69 feet by the end of the century.
You can see how clay this soil is, and you can imagine how much water it can hold. So if you have a high tide event, a king tide, for example, and as the sea level rises, you can imagine if this wasn't here to stop it or to slow it down and control that flow, all of that water would be moving into homes and businesses and causing damage. The tidal marsh is habitat to dozens of mammals, hundreds of different species of birds. Wetlands and tidal marshes included are also really important for meeting the challenge of climate change. They are very good at sequestering carbon, so they pull carbon out of the atmosphere at higher rates than forests. They also incorporate that carbon into the soil at higher rates than forests, so reducing the greenhouse gas effect.
In 2016, Save the Bay helped pass a measure called Measure AA. It sets aside $500 million over the course of 20 years that can be used primarily for restoration of the baylands, also to increase accessibility and recreation opportunities for people that visit those sites. There are still parcels of land that are privately owned that we're waiting to get turned over into public space. These threats are not over. Luckily, we have Bay residents that care and are willing to fight for these habitats.